to admit all. So people admit all. Okay, so good morning, Barry. Good morning, Gareth.
Morning.
Good morning, Margaret. Good morning, Henry.
Morning.
Good morning, Caitlin.
Hey, Con.
Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining. If you've just joined, if you could go on mute, that would be that would be great. Thank you very much indeed. To let Con have the con. Is that right? Is that a naval term? I don't know, but anyway,
It
sounds
is.
quite Star Trek. But there we go. So there we go. Brendan, good morning. If you could, I'll mute you, Brendan. That's fine. Thank you very much indeed. We'll wait another minute or two. Morning, and we'll then we can start with the title of LDI and the gilt market. Some concerns. Anatomy of a crisis, Con. I think we're calling this, aren't we, as a heading? So,
well,
that
was the very first of 3 blogs. I posted a new one this morning on the Playpen website, and
Right.
Henry has cross-posted it.
Cool.
Anyway, so Andre, why don't we start with that poll?
You're on mute, Andre.
So the poll is in the chat.
Okay. So if everybody clicks on the chat, there will be a poll, and the question here is: when questioned about their involvement with liability investment, the Wall Street Journal report. Sorry, my fault. A spokesman for the pensions regulator said it does not drive particular investment strategies. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? So if you see below there's agree, disagree, don't know, and then you can submit your vote. So this is a poll at the very beginning of our session. If you read that statement and question in the chat, do you agree, disagree, or don't know? So we'll leave it about a minute and then you can submit your thoughts. Phil, if you could do that. Margaret, if you could do that.
Dave, I'm not seeing it. I just see.
Yeah, not seeing it.
You're not seeing it in the chat, in the meeting chat?
No, I see meeting chat, and then Philip was invited, Brendan was invited. That's it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So right at the very top, you can't see the poll.
No.
No.
Oh, okay.
Hold on a second. Let me
Right.
Let me
stop
just
sharing for a moment.
let me just double check that. Apologies,
Let's
Con.
abandon the poll and just go to the presentation.
Yeah,
Maybe
okay, let's just go for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're trying to be really clever then, having a poll. But actually, Con, make the point. The point is, do you agree?
Very simple. The pensions regulator has stated publicly that they do not influence investment strategies. And I, for one, do not believe that for a second. And I just wanted to poll the audience to see what their take on this was. We won't do it now, so there we are. Anyway, let's go to the slides and let's get on with doing this thing.
Okay. Just bear me one moment. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
That's fine.
Right, good. Well, anyway, this is actually a quotation that we used. It was the lead for a presentation we did 4 or 5 months ago. The thing which surprised people then was the emphasis and the placing we put on actuarial standards. And in the course of this presentation, I intend to explain to you why that was. I would also add that at that point in time, we were concerned only for value destruction to pension scheme members. I think now we have to be concerned with the much broader damage that's being done by liability-driven investment strategies to the gilt market. And that is a fundamental route for almost all other financial markets is pretty substantial. Let's go to the next slide, please, Andre, and go down 3 or 4. Right. This is just a catch up on what has actually happened, and it's really quite interesting to see the reaction from the gilt market. First of all, there is actually a small reaction around the Monetary Policy Committee meeting. The gilt market yields, these are conventional 30-year gilts. Small reaction to the Monetary Policy Committee meeting, which as much as anything was a little bit of disappointment that the change had only been 0.5%. Then, of course, we get the famous budget or mini budget, and the reaction was immediate and substantial. And that was the external shock which triggered an internal instability, which is an endogenous risk associated with LDI. The fact that a large shock to start with created a demand for additional cash collateral and led to further selling in the markets, and the whole thing becomes self-reinforcing and continued to be so until the bank intervened. Now, what's interesting about the bank intervention is that the total purchases were very small. Until last Friday, less than £5 billion in total, though the threat was, or the available was quoted as being 65 billion. Let's go to the next slide and click on to the footnotes as well, please. Now, this is the foreign exchange market, and this is actually only interesting in one regard, which is that the weakness of sterling was really quite dramatic. In fact, from the monetary policy decision onwards. What's interesting about that is that foreigners or overseas holders hold some 30% or so of the gilt market. They are an important source of liquidity for the market, and with currency like that, they're not going to be there. Okay, so that set, the market had already been really rather febrile all year, really a little bit skittish, and yields had been rising all year. There's an interesting measure of how much collateral call had taken place before this crisis and that which was demanded subsequently. The PPF, which, by the way, has been reducing its exposure to LDI and to gilts all year, had by the Friday of the Friday following the crisis, or sorry, the Thursday following the crisis, experienced a total of £2.5 billion worth of collateral calls, of which 1.6 billion had occurred in this crisis. So calls earlier in the year had been a short £1 billion, which on a £27 billion portfolio is an interesting number. It's about 10% of the portfolio at the beginning of the year. I suspect that others would have suffered worse shocks because, unlike the PPF, they weren't reducing their exposure. Next slide. Andre?
Yep.
Right. Carry on down 3 or 4 lines. Go again. Right. This is really rather important. The Bank of England did not intervene to bail out LDI. Its concern was simply market integrity. They actually said as much. They said the purpose of these purchases will be to restore orderly market conditions. Now, there was talk in the FT article that prompted our second blog that of a quasi-permanent support fund, backstop fund. That will not work. It's simply granting a form of free put option to any market participant. That is a surefire way to lose a hell of a lot of money to whoever chooses to speculate. And if such a backstop were to be put in place, I, for one, would be reopening the hedge fund that I used to be involved with, and we will be buying bucket loads of gilts on credit. And if it goes our way, we get rich. And if it doesn't, you own them. won't work. Go down some more, please. The situation, this is basically the model. The model is really simple. What we had was an external shock, in nature, political and economic. One of the important things about such shocks is they're not usually knowable, and they are usually not controllable in either timing or size. Now, the meltdown did not occur because of the shock. The meltdown occurred because that fed into the feedback spiral of liability-driven investment. Absent liability-driven investment, we would have seen a 4 or 5 point decline, and that would have been it. We would then have been in the slow raising of rates that's to be expected given the state of inflation and the economy. Unless we resolve the liability-driven investment spiral, such meltdowns will recur. You can make them slower by restricting the levels of leverage and similar things, but you still won't be able to take them away. Let's go down some more. Right. Can we go to the next page? So what's LDI? This is a Bank of England presentation. It's actually taken from their letter, from John Cunliffe's letter to Mel Stride at Treasury Select Committee. I recommend that everyone on this webcast go in and read that letter. If they can't find it directly, drop me a line and I'll send it to them. What's interesting here is it just shows what's actually particularly interesting in here is that the Bank of England recognises that what schemes have been doing is borrowing money, and that is legally problematic. They are describing repo borrowing as borrowing, which I also believe it to be. So let's go to the next set of slides, please. So what is LDI? Well, the important thing about LDI is the matching of perceived risks among and between assets and liabilities. Comes in two forms: a simple LDI, which involves no leverage, and there's leveraged LDI. Leveraged LDI has been the principal cause of the meltdown. We've known that borrowing money to buy bonds or equities is a recipe for disaster. It was the cause of the 1929 New York Stock Exchange crash. Let's go down the page some more. That borrowing has resulted in collateral calls on both the repo contracts and on the derivatives contracts. Now, that raises in turn an interesting question with those contracts. Unlike ordinary unit trusts or shares or bonds, those contracts have unlimited liability. The counterpart to the contract has recourse to scheme assets, in some cases actually directly without even having the trustees intervene, which I find absolutely amazing. That in turn, those calls led to distressed sales of assets in markets. This meltdown now is not the first time we've seen distressed sales in the markets. We saw them earlier in the year, and in the index-linked gilt market, it's been evident on a number of occasions through the past year. The important thing is, yes, they've caused real losses to schemes, but more importantly, they've disrupted the gilt market, and that really is unforgivable. So let's go to the next slide, please. Yes, well, should have mentioned that, shouldn't I? LDI has actually been zealously promoting the use of LDI. They have been telling people to de-risk, they have been telling people to use LDI. I know of some pension funds which have actually been told that they should be hedged to certain minimum percentages, and that's hedged against interest rates, which I'll come back to later because that is not a real risk. So let's have a look at the law of derivatives. Well, the root law that's relevant is the IORP 2, Article 19. That says you can use derivatives for a reduction in investment risks. Okay, now let's go to the UK transposition of that law. That says contribute to a reduction of risks. That transposition is critical. It's faulty. It's incorrect. It should read investment risks. Now, the important thing to realize about investment risks is they apply only to the asset portfolio. So you can hedge the risks of your overseas equities with a derivative. But what you can't do is hedge inflation or longevity or any of the liability determinants with derivatives. It's absolutely clear that one goes back to the original European legislation. There isn't a court in the land that would deny that. This has been a serious failing on the part of the Pension Protection Fund. They have either missed or chosen to ignore that. Next slide. Consequences. These are the consequences. You can't hedge your liabilities using derivatives. That's inflation, longevity, and most scheme optionality as well. Those risks can actually be hedged by non-derivative assets like insurance policies, like index-linked bonds, but they can't be hedged using derivatives. Now, the interest rate risk, which is the biggest area that's being hedged by all and sundry, is a perceived risk. It's not a real risk. Interest rates do not affect the liabilities of a pension scheme. Carry on, please. Let's just go bring up 2 more, please. The investment risks on foreign exchange and so on I've dealt with. The important thing to realize here is there's no correlation between gilt yields and DB liabilities. There is a strong correlation between gilt yields and valuation methods. What that tells us is that the valuation methods are not fit for purpose. Okay, I'll leave you to mull on that one. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about hedging the discount rate. Discount rate, hedging, interest rates do not appear in the determination of the pensions payable. My pensions don't depend on where gilt yields are, or for that matter, were. All that the discount rate does is determine a trajectory or amortization schedule for liabilities. The interest rate risk is perceived, it is not real. Let's go down some more. Right, in and of itself, variability of the discount rate doesn't matter. You know, your liability values, your present values of liabilities are going up and down depending on interest rate levels. And that's fine unless you base actions or decisions upon them. It doesn't matter at all. Now, there is a natural rate of scheme funding or amortization which should have been used, and that is the rate of growth required of the contribution to meet those projected values. Ian and I called this a contractual accrual rate, and it only changes if the expected benefits change. Those are the circumstances in which you revise it. We can talk about that in questions later. more in more detail. Now, even if you are using conventional gilts as assets to hedge this interest rate, what that actually does is simply introduce a dependency, a risk on the performance of those gilts. And that's actually what's been going on with the derivatives so-called hedging that's been happening. It's introducing a dependency into the scheme which was not there before. Let's go to the next slide. Now let's deal with the law on borrowing. This is the IORP directive. It says you can only borrow for short-term liquidity purposes. That's a matter of weeks, a month, perhaps at the most. But schemes are borrowing rather a lot. Let's go to the UK law. Okay. It's again very clear. It goes a bit further than the IORP in that it makes it evident that anything which actually could require repayment from the assets of the scheme is a form of borrowing. So schemes can't borrow, and yet we are seeing the pensions regulator allowing repo all over the place. So let's go to the next slide. Repo. Economically, there is absolutely no doubt it's secured borrowing. And what's important about it is it effectively subordinates the interests of scheme members to those of the repo counterparty. It's been widely utilised in the finances and long positions all over the place, in conventional bonds, in gilt-edged securities. It's the bread and butter of the money markets. And the repurchase leg of that clearly satisfies the statute implied test of borrowing of repayment from the scheme's assets. Carry on. So schemes have been borrowing for long terms and far in excess of their liquidity needs. This basically is illegal, and yet TPR has not been enforcing any action against it. Rather more, they've actually been encouraging, from what I can see. ICMA actually says the principal use of repo is the secured borrowing. There's the quotation from them. Then we have TPR. We understand that repo financing is structured as the sale and repurchase of an asset, and as such would not amount to borrowing for the purposes of the investment regulations. Well, you know what? The Bank of England doesn't agree with them. Let me just say one thing. We have heard that there is a legal opinion saying that repo isn't borrowing. I've been unable to see that legal opinion. If anyone has a copy that they'd like to share with me or tell me which law firm produced it, I'd love to hear about it. I think that what's going on is that there's an elision in the law. Basically, not ICMA, but ISDA produced legal opinions which were concerned with the recharacterization of repo as secured borrowing. Repo is not secured borrowing in the ordinary course of events because there's no registered charge of the security. But you know, courts of law can recharacterize things as they will. The repo legal opinion and the European Collateral Act basically ensure that recharacterization can't occur. In other words, that repo is not secured borrowing. And I think that has been extended to be repo is not borrowing. And that's a basic, really childish error. Let's go to the next slide. Are repos derivatives? No. Carry on to the next lot. Right. Now, repos are not derivatives. They are operations, not derivatives of securities. They're operations on those securities. clearly for the economic purpose of borrowing money. Amazingly, the PPF's documentation seemed to think that they were derivatives, although they've subsequently, I had a word with them and they've subsequently removed that from their website. Go to the next slide, please. Right, these are the legal risks of LDI. Schemes are borrowing heavily. It's not lawful. Schemes are hedging liabilities with derivatives. It's not lawful. Schemes are hedging illusory risks in spades, interest rate risk. About 1.5 trillion, according to the Investment Association. Schemes are buying assets which increase the cost of pension provision. The classic case there was index-linked gilts when they were yielding inflation less rates of return. It's basically the borrowing and derivatives contracts which generated the collateral calls, notably a peculiar form of pooled fund, the LDI funds, the variable capital entities. I don't believe that very many of the small pension schemes that invested in those actually believed that it was possible that they could be called upon to put up more money. I think that those that were actually aware where it had been truly disclosed to them, I think that the majority of them thought it was a situation and were probably assured that it was a situation which would never happen. The other thing, of course, is the documentation around those. I've read 5 prospectuses and annexes to and so on. And in my career, I've probably read over 9,000 prospectuses, maybe over 10,000. It's somewhere between the two, probably. I have even written over 20. I am amazed to read the prospectuses and related documentation for those funds. They are incredibly convoluted. With 3 of them, I think they're actually, even after rafts of legalese, they seem to be incomplete. Trying to work out exactly what the procedure would be in the event of non-payment of a claim for additional capital when the fund had a negative net asset value was unavailable. You were left to guess. Or call your lawyer and make him even richer. Let's go on with the rest, please. Next. So, trustees should be aware. So too should LDI managers, because they are roped in by the law and with respect to complying with this stuff. But above all else, the people who have explaining to do are the pensions regulator. Next slide. Why did this go systemic? This is a very interesting little chart. It's chart C, box 5, from the Financial Stability Report of November 2018. The data, as it says, is at January 2018. So the regulator and the Bank of England and Uncle Tom Cobley and all were aware of the position as at that date. I mean, subsequently, the 900 million of interest rate swap exposure was estimated to be closer to 1.5 billion. I also think that their estimate of the sensitivity is a little on the low side, but you know, 100 plus million, 110 million or so for a basis point move in interest rates, just on the interest rate swaps. And look at where pension funds were relative to hedge funds, the world's favorite bête noire. They manage their interest rate exposure. Their interest rate risk exposure and their overall exposure is not a lot at all. Even insurers, lots and lots of exposure, 600 billion. Not very much actual risk exposure, maybe 12, 14 billion, something like that. Now, the question I'd ask beyond that is this. One of the few places where people are taking comfort here is that we are closer to buyout levels. We can now buy the scheme out. What do you think is going to happen to the insurance industry when you merge that pension fund diamond into the insurer's diamond? You're going to have an enormous and far riskier insurance industry. I mean, the idea that you could put 1.5 billion, which is the sort of number we have now, into the insurance industry is cloud cuckoo land. You'll never get it done in less than a decade. And more likely, you just never get it done. And in doing so, it'd probably also destroy most of the insurance industry. Next slide, please, Andre. So, what motivated LDI? Well, the answer is it was an accounting standard and the related regulatory standard for scheme funding valuation in Pensions Act 2004 and the scheme funding regs in 2005. David Konate-Ahulu and Rob Gardner will tell you that they sold the original swap hedging interest rates to France Provident back in 2002. That was the start of all this. So the resolution to the problem we have is not about lower borrowing, lower leverage multiples. They simply make the shock needed to create another meltdown a little larger and perhaps make the process, once it's underway, a little slower, but they don't resolve the problem. It sits there and is hovering in the wings at all times. Banning them outright almost certainly won't work, because in a recent webinar poll, 90% of respondents said they thought there was a future, there was a role for LDI in the future. I think that the resolution then is really very obvious. We correct the misguided accounting standards, and we actually correct also their funding regulations. The funding regulations actually don't need a change in the law. The funding regulations simply need a reinterpretation, which is much more sensible, which is to consider the promise made by the employer and the contribution made, employer and employee, and the projected benefits. And the discount rate is that rate which equalizes those. It's the rate at which the amortization of the thing should be done. It's a technique used by HMRC in a number of different areas of tax accounting for long-term liabilities. That's not difficult. Changing the accounting standards up. We've had so many arguments over the years with the accounting standards boards. It's not funny. I mean, I first argued against the use of mark-to-market on liability valuations at an NEPF conference in a year I can't remember, 2003, 4, maybe 5, against Ian McIntosh, who was then with the Accounting Standards Board. Actually, I sent him an email asking him which year it was, but I haven't heard back yet. The other thing I think we should quite simply do is enforce the laws already in existence. And that the pensions regulator has been particularly remiss in doing. Let's go to the next one. Said they're cheap and simple. That's it. There were going to be a couple of polls, but I don't think we can run them, can we?
Yeah, Andre, what do you think about the polls?
I will give them a go now. I think you have to add them live rather than in advance, which is what I try to do. So if you
Okay.
bear with me one moment,
Okay.
carry on, and I'll
Let's
I'll
go
get that running in
to
the background.
let's go to Barry Mack. Barry, if you could unmute. You very kindly put the letter, I think that Con mentioned in the chat, so that's available on a link.
Thank you.
You've got a question as well, Barry. I think potentially there, Barry, on the gilt yields.
Yeah, hi, Con. You said that there's no correlation between gilt yields and DB liabilities, and I understand why you say that, but is that really the case if your aim is actually to buy out a scheme when you know that the pricing from an insurer will largely be based on gilt yields?
Well, I mean, if you like, you can tie the thing to the value of diamonds. If you want to choose some arbitrary excess cost, you can. And that's what you're doing in choosing buyout. Buyout only became popular. Buyout is extremely expensive. It only became popular because of the accounting standards and the application of LDI. LDI has cost schemes an awful lot of money to implement, and people seem to have lost sight of that fact. The drag of LDI has probably been about 2% relative to a fund which was 60-40 or 70-30 equity gilt, global equity, global debt. It's been a very expensive strategy.
It might be
Unfortunately,
expensive.
let's just say, unfortunately, the problem that we've had is that LDI, as long as rates were declining, LDI would show strong positive returns. Rates dropped from 6 or 7%, actually from higher than that in the late 90s, to nothing. That's an awful lot of capital gains. That's an awful lot of return that was baked into schemes, and very little of it survived the management and cost processes.
So it might be expensive, but it still discharges the trustees from their responsibilities and transfers
That's
the
not
risk
their job. Their
to
job is
another
to
entity.
maintain pension schemes. You seem to think that the role of trustees is to close a scheme. It isn't. The role of trustees is to maintain a scheme under its rules. They have an option to close it should that be warranted. The requirement, the circumstances that made it warranted were that the costs by regulation and practice were made outrageous.
I think it's
Do you agree with that, Barry?
No, I don't. I think it's an
Okay.
option that trustees can legitimately exercise in order to protect the long-term benefits of the members of the scheme, and it also acts as a transfer of risk, which removes that risk from the sponsor and allows the sponsor to get on with its business.
That's completely ultra vires. Removing risk from the sponsor should not be an obligation or a requirement or a responsibility of a trustee.
Well, I disagree. I think if you can do so, and
So
the sponsor's willing to pay for it,
then
that protects the members' benefits.
You're arguing the sponsor is effectively a member of the scheme. Then, I don't believe that's true.
Well, sorry, Con. Go on.
There are circumstances in which the sponsor may be considered a member of the scheme, but that's actually when all other members have been discharged.
Okay. Can we just go on to this poll? Can everybody
disagree with me that the cause of LDI was the interest rate, was the discount rate?
Is that a question to Barry?
Yeah.
Barry?
I understand why schemes have gone down the LDI route. I'm still open-minded about this concept of the interest rate risk. I think it depends on for what purpose you're measuring your DB liabilities, and if your purpose is ultimately to buy out the scheme, then you have got an interest rate risk.
Okay. everybody can see the poll, can we just have a quick look at the poll, which I think now works, Andre, which is great. And this sort of hammers home the big message that Con's put forward here regarding banning LDI, placing restrictions on LDI, enforcing the law, correcting the accounting standards, or none of the above. If you can see that, there's about 19 people on. If you could make your vote, be very interesting to see what the winner is. And at the moment, it looks like enforcing the law is the winner. And if you're a trustee, Margaret, I know you're a trustee, for example. Maybe it's time to sit down with the lawyers and the investment advisors and say, are these points? I think Con has done a fantastic presentation, and the reality is, are schemes breaking the law or not? I guess is the question, and it not necessarily. It's all about the nature and the framework of the law and the subjectivity of the law. Con, I'm not saying that law is. We all know the law is not always 1 or a 0. Sometimes it can be grey. Are trustees living in a grey environment where these points have just not been checked out? What do you think, Margaret?
I think trustees listen to advisors because trustees don't inherently have the skills to be able to interpret IAS standards in the law, etc. So I think trustees tend to follow the herd a little bit, and I must say trustees are very nervous of doing anything that the regulator wouldn't like. So I think if trustees understood that the regulator was averse to borrowing in any guise in the fund, then trustees would have been talking to their investment advisors. But I mean, as a trustee, I think I have, accepted LDI as one of those things that you do, and done for the best intentions, and perhaps that's wrong and should be revisited.
I wouldn't accuse trustees of having some malign intent here or being culpable. I think the culpability lies elsewhere. I think the vast majority, certainly almost all of the trustees that I know who did engage in LDI, did so because their advisors and the pensions regulator was pushing them towards it. The number of people who have told me that the standard sales pitch is 90 to 95% of people are doing this, you can't be wrong. It's just amazing.
I think we're saying the same thing. Effectively, trustees do rely on experts, and there is a herd sort of instinct that if everybody's doing it, it must be all right, and there hasn't so far been any pain. And that's the basis of many crises. Actually, is almost a bit of complacency and an expectation that things will always continue.
It takes herd behaviour to generate this stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm actually talking to a group of pension schemes this evening in the US and Canada. And the question they've asked there is could a meltdown in the markets occur here the way it has in London? And the answer is pretty clearly no, because the scale of adoption of LDI in Canada is negligible. It seems to be one fund. In the US, it's a handful of funds that are in trouble and basically are trying to limit downside. Are they capable of disrupting the US TIPS markets or US treasuries? No. They could sell their entire portfolios 2 or 3 times over in the morning and not impact the price of the treasury. But what we have here is a group that together were, relative to market sizes, huge. At one point, it was estimated that the pensions world owned over 80% of the index-linked market. I mean, that's a little strange when you tend to think that most of them will tend to behave in a similar way at similar times. It makes the risk involved really. It's latent, but risk always is latent. As someone said, you know, turkeys think life is great until Christmas Eve.
This is true. This is true.
Well,
Now,
I'm sorry. There's also
Go on.
this thing of, you know, Ian and I and John Swain had been naysayers on this stuff for a very long time. I've heard people say that the gilt market meltdown was a 1 in 400 year event. This is bloody ridiculous. It was a 1 in 1 event. You know, as long as rates were declining, it was not going to happen. But the moment we saw rates decline for the first time, it happened. That's 1 in 1. That is not 1 in 400.
It's a big difference, isn't it, Con? Yeah, I get that. The poll result looks like enforcing the law is the winner at 43%. What does that mean?
Can that, actually?
You're quite pleased with that, yeah. So what does that mean then? What, in practical terms, does that mean trustees bang on the table, ring up all their lawyers, or
it's the trustees have got to run down all their repo and sell off the assets, or whichever assets they want to sell off, to repo their repo, to repay their repo. The enforcing the law actually means you can't use derivatives to hedge interest rates. You can't use derivatives to hedge inflation. You can't use derivatives to hedge longevity. You've got to find securities and instruments that are assets with unlimited liability. Sorry, with limited liability to hedge those. So you buy index-linked bonds, they will hedge inflation. But you couldn't use a longevity swap. Similarly, I don't know what you'd hedge longevity with. That's rather difficult. You know, short position improved shares, maybe. There's the instrument doesn't exist as yet, but I think could be devised. There have been longevity related bonds issued. The EIB issued them for a few years. Any further questions?
Yeah, I was going to say that Gareth Morgan's made the point that if the law is subjective, then it's badly drafted. Can the law actually be changed because of this event, Con?
It doesn't
should it be
need to
changed?
be. It doesn't. Well, the only thing that needs to be changed is it has to be made clear to people that the investment is implicitly there, and that I don't believe there's a judge in the land would argue that it isn't there. I mean, you see through to the original IORP in law, and the withdrawal agreement makes it absolutely sure that makes it absolutely certain that you should still be doing that. That practice, I don't believe there's a solicitor or a lawyer in the country that would argue contrary to that. Similarly, you know, is repo or isn't it borrowing? Well, it may not be secured borrowing, but it's borrowing. You know, I'd like to see the opinion that says it isn't borrowing. I think, as I said, I think there's been an illusion of secured borrowing, which I accept it isn't, because of the absence of the registration of the charge. But yeah, the fact that it's not secured borrowing doesn't mean it's not borrowing. And I think there we would like probably a court to decide.
Okay. And as a sort of a dumb question, you know, we're in an environment where millions of pounds are, you know, you're talking about repos and borrowing. I was surprised that you were saying effectively it's unsecured. I mean, which lender in the land lends money in an unsecured environment? You know, they're not even sort of taking, you know.
Well,
yeah.
the lender in a repo has possession of the security.
Right.
It's
Oh,
still
okay.
your security.
Yeah.
But it's in his possession.
Yeah.
Okay? It's only if you default that he takes possession.
Right.
What you
Okay.
do not have is a charge over that security in the interim. Similarly, if you think about it, when you pay collateral to a dealer, that money does not become the dealer's. Okay, it's still your money. He has possession of it, and he can usually use it for certain purposes, or actually, more generally, if it was cash coming in, it's just commingled with everything else. And I mean, what many schemes did not appreciate in the days when rates were dropping and collateral was being sent to them, and they were merrily investing it and leveraging up, was that spending that cash collateral received was actually borrowing that collateral money.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Professor Bromwich, you're on the call. Do you want to any views on what Con said, or Charles, Malcolm Brown? Maybe you might have a view. Mike, Professor Bromwich, why don't you go first? You're on mute, Michael.
I know, I'm not now.
Oh, there we go.
I've listened to that, and it is very compelling what's been said. But the only thing is, if you look at any of the people on the other side, they make vast amounts of arguments, and you hear one saying, for example, well, this stuff has done us very well for 29 years. And that sort of argument.
Well, Michael, there's a very simple answer to that. Yes, indeed, it has. Had you bought zero coupon 100-year jobbies, you would have done even better. You'd have been long the gilt market through the longest rally in its history. Of course you made money, but the first time it turns against you, it destroys itself.
Yeah. But I mean, the other thing I guess is Con's, as it were, standing there, and there's a great wave of people on the other side who have clear interest. Sorry.
Oh dear.
No, it's all right. I'm alive. Clear
Glad to hear
it. Well, it's the price of this cup of coffee.
Well, there you go. All right. Yeah, very funny.
Let me just say, you've got this vast numbers of people whose futures are determined by pushing this stuff, and I don't see how one can influence that by talking to people like us. We have to be much more serious. Well, basically, in some sense, you now ride in on the catastrophe which has appeared, and might manage that. But it is actually very, very difficult for a few people to try and change something which is
well,
a bit like
Michael, I agree. But what we want to do with Playpen is be innovative and be a think tank.
It's difficult to do doesn't mean that we ought not to try.
Yeah, we can try. And actually, I think on the back of this Con, it's very powerful. We will get a press release out on behalf of Playpen and its members to raise this awareness, and hopefully that will get out into the industry, and more trustees, more funders, more LDI providers will see it. And it's big stuff, as Michael says. It's affecting potentially millions of people, so it's big stuff. So
well, it's basically I mean, we've raised the cost of government debt financing by 150 basis points in 2 weeks. That just cannot be a way to run a country. You can't finance government activities with that sort of volatility in your cost of finance. How do you plan any project? What interest rate do you assume you're going to have to pay?
who knows?
It's not feasible. The serious harms here are those types of harms. They are macroeconomic. I mean, the pensions regulator can be expected. What is very interesting is I have not yet seen, and as far as of earlier today, it was not yet on the Work and Pensions Committee website. They sent a letter with about 14 questions in it to Charles Council and the pensions regulator, asking for a reply by yesterday. So I would have expected to see the reply available on Work and Pensions Committee's website today, but as of earlier today, it wasn't there. What I would like to see is pensions regulators' response to that. One of which is going to be that macro level supervision, financial stability was not within our mandate. Well, unfortunately, that argument is empty because you cannot actually supervise and regulate at the individual institution level without being aware of the macro climate and the consequences of the actions at the micro level for that. But doubtless they will try to argue that in some convoluted form. That's called pass the buck to the Bank of England.
Yeah, it's called passing the buck. Charles, Malcolm Brown, or Henry Tapper, have you got an opinion on before we wind up? Or
Yeah, I've got a quick word or two. Thank you very much indeed, Con, as always, highly educative. And I do admire the level of knowledge you have. Secondly, I'm hugely relieved that we went with about 79% investment in equities, despite recent events. That served us extremely well, and we've been resistant towards de-risking, frankly. And the last point I'd like to make is that I belong to an SME consultation group, which is recognised by the PPF and I think by the regulator as well. The point was made about putting out a press release and whatever, which I think is a very good idea. However, safety in numbers. If any of the folks at this meeting would be interested in exploring possible collaboration with the SME consultation group, I'd be very happy to put them in touch.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think I'll have a word with Ian, and I think we'd like to take you up on that kind offer, Charles.
They'd be delighted, Con, and I'm sure you'll add a hefty weight to it.
Charles, let me check with Ian. He's my co-author on this stuff.
Absolutely happy.
In other words,
please blame more than welcome. Sorry?
In other words, please blame him and not me.
No, no blame game for me, Con.
There we go. And if you'd encourage other people to join Playpen as well, Charles, to have these sessions, that'd be good equally. So we'll give you Con, you give us a feedback. I think probably the rate would be 5 to 1, 5 of yours for 1 of Con, maybe. I don't know, but that's just wishful thinking.
I'm sure he'll fly above us. If you don't mind, I'll forward on whatever press release or whatever you folks put out to the group. Yeah. As a means of introduction.
Yeah, that's fine. And we'll get you Con's. You got Con's email address, Charles?
Con and I have been in contact probably far more than Con would wish.
Oh, okay. All right. Oh, you're that Charles, are you? Right. Okay.
Yes. Hello.
Actually, there's one guy that I actually went away and counted the number of emails in the course of the month of October, and we were on day 11. He has sent me 31 emails.
Wow.
I apologise, Con.
No, certainly not.
They're not all Charleses. They're not all Charleses.
This is someone else.
Okay.
Anyway,
we got last minute hand raised by Professor Bromwich. Mike Bromwich, do you want us to say a last point there, Michael? Or you're on mute, Michael. Sorry, you're on mute. Sorry.
2 quickies. What about the Financial Control Authority, or whatever the hell that's called? The
Financial
regulator.
Conduct Authority really doesn't have any responsibility here, other than perhaps the LDI pooled funds. But most of those appear to have been incorporated overseas, although overseas in some cases appears to be Jersey and Guernsey, an awful lot in Ireland, some in Dublin, and I have put inquiries out to friends of mine in Dublin, of which I have quite a few, as I'm Irish, asking them precisely why Ireland was chosen as a domicile for these funds. Interestingly, most of them seem, even though they are Irish domiciled, seem to be governed by English law, which is a little bit strange because some aspects of the structure don't look as if they are consistent with English law. It's a minefield. I don't fully understand it as yet, but there is potentially a liability there for the Financial Conduct Authority, because the regulation of such funds would ordinarily fall under their wing.
Yeah. The other question I had, well, another question, just a comment really. Accountants figure, I'm an accountant, accountants figured rather strongly as the sort of original cause of all this. I think that's being a little unfair on accountants for a number of reasons. One, they simply said, there is a deficit, you better put it somewhere in your accounts to show people it. That doesn't lead to all this lot. Secondly, they did also say,
I'm sorry, Michael, to actually say there is a deficit means that you have an accurate and appropriate way of measuring it. What I'm saying is the method that they chose for that measure was inappropriate and misleading.
But they tend, as you know, accountants, where there is a professional body involved in the subject, like actuaries,
Technically,
they always tend to use the professional body's view, and that was.
Let me draw a distinction. There is the professional body of accountants, which is not guilty of anything. The group which are at fault here are the accounting standards setters. Of course, they're merely dominated by the professional body.
There we go. We put that right then, Con. Hopefully, yeah.
We won't put that out on the.
No, we won't put that. We won't put that out on the press release.
Very few people distinguish between the accounting profession and the accounting standards board, although I suppose one should properly.
There are three of them. Boards.
Yes, I know. I've also tried to work out what this body, Ian McIntosh is now at ISAR, actually does, because I don't really know.
Yeah, maybe we can find out and put it out there. So,
I've got an email into him. I'll find out then.
You'll find out, yeah. Con, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm conscious that time is dragging on. It's been a fantastic presentation. Are you happy for the slideshow to be sent to anybody who wants it? Yeah. Or if anybody wants that, if you could...
anything I've said can be quoted.
Yeah. We'll get Joanne, our PR lady, to have a chat with you, I think, and get something out. Would be really good. So I really, really appreciate everybody's time. Right. I hope you enjoyed it. It is probably one of the biggest subjects we've probably covered in the last few months, and it's a massive impact and very topical, a hot topic, probably a very, very hot topic. So Con, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. Apologies for the technology at the very beginning, but we got there in the end. And thanks for your polls and your answers on the polls. And if you're not a member of Playpen, please join. If you like Playpen, please invite others to join. And we really, really appreciate everybody's input, and I hope you enjoyed it. We do want to make a difference, genuinely, and so I really, really appreciate you all joining. And as we usually say, peace in the East, as we hope for some sort of conclusion between the with the Ukrainian conflict, and can't believe it's October and it's still going on. But you know, that's just you know, the sadness of war, I guess. But anyway, there we go. But no, really appreciate that. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll hopefully look forward to seeing you next week, when I think we've got Mobius Life talking on some investment ideas. So we'll come back to you next week. But if you have any blogs, or if you like Con's blog, please visit the site, blog away, put your own blog or comment on Con's blog, and let's see if we can make a difference. That's what I think we should do. So appreciate everybody's time. Thank you very much indeed, and have a safe week. See you later. Bye.